I'd like to invite you now into a time of meditation and reflection. And so let's start by getting a little grounded in our bodies. If it feels right, place your feet squarely on the ground, maybe wiggle your toes. Take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. Let your shoulders drop a bit. Let your brow relax. Maybe you'd like to soften your gaze or even close your eyes. And as we open our hearts today to reflection on rage, grief, and goodness, I'd like to invite you into a time of reflecting a little more deeply on grief. Grief, sadness, the act of mourning. These are deep waters. These are deeply primal human experiences that our dominant culture does not make space for, does not make time for, and is desperate to distract us from. But in this safe space, in this shared space together, we can open our hearts just a bit, just a little more than usual, and notice what's there around grief for us. Knowing that all our feelings are okay. Not all behaviors are, of course, but all feelings are, and this includes grief, collective grief, personal grief. And it's okay if you are grieving this morning. At the heart of grief is a loss. And at the heart of this loss is love, a connection with a person, connection with an ecosystem, with a community, a connection with fundamental rights, with the web of humanity. At the heart of our loss is love, a connection. Francis Weller writes, "My grief says that I dared to love, that I allowed another to enter the very core of my being and find a home in my heart. Grief is how the soul recounts the depth to which someone has touched our lives. To love is to accept the rights of grief." It's okay to feel grief and to feel utterly bereft, out at sea, fundamentally and viscerally altered. This is deeply human. Our sorrow works on us, it reshapes us. There's no returning back to normal, only surrendering into our next becoming. Rashani Rue writes, "There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief that leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength." In order to come to this place of deeper intimacy with life, this place of leaning into love with even more exquisite tenderness, we have to engage with our grief. Let ourselves move a little closer to it with enough spaciousness to learn from it, to learn about it. And this can be scary. It can be deeply uncomfortable to engage with our grief. And so today, I'm not going to ask you to make a deep dive into your grief, but just to experiment with a simple practice. A practice of curiosity, a practice of feeling into these questions. I invite you to ask yourself, where does grief live in your life right now? Where does it live in your body? I invite you to type into the chat, but not to submit it yet. But just type into the chat, where does grief live in your life right now? Where does grief live in your life right now? And I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds because we're all going to hit submit at the same time. All right, go ahead and hit send. Grief lives on my tensed up shoulders, in my heart, in my gut, in the news, in my relationships with family, missing friends, missing my wife. Grief lives in my throat and chest, in my loneliness. My dad passed away last year and his birthday is coming up. Noticing that the grief is suppressed. Grief in the news. Grief living in the forest fires in the West. Grief for dream. Grief living in memories. In the loss in my heart for my daughter. And we can continue to name where the grief is living in our lives in the chat. And I want to just offer my deep gratitude for all of you who are naming this grief and sharing it with us, for trusting us in this space, in this church community, in this time to witness and hold your grief with you. So I'd like to invite you into a second experiment in our meditation today. Maybe you'd like to close your eyes if they're not closed already. But imagine that this grief of yours, whatever grief it is you're holding, whether you can name it or whether it's ambiguous for you, imagine it as a body of water. A body of water surrounded by a beautiful forest. And you are the only person by this body of water. And you in this space, you have all the space you desire. You have all the space you need. And you can be as far away from that body of water as you need to be, just observing your grief. And if you imagine your grief as that body of water, I wonder, what does it look like? How deep does it go? Are the waters still? Are the waters rough? And as you sit in proximity to your grief, what do you notice? What thoughts arise when you witness your grief? And wherever you find yourself right now, I wonder if you could work your way into offering yourself compassion in this moment. Maybe even picture wrapping compassion around yourself like a blanket, surrounding yourself with love, offering generosity to your tender heart, feeling generosity for your humanity. We are all human, all in this together. And now we open up this compassion and tenderness to our greater community. as we name and honor the sorrows and the celebrations and great turnings in our lives. Our hearts are with Maria Logsdon this morning as she grieves the loss of her mother, Joan Schreck Logsdon, who died September 2nd at the age of 93. And we lift up this morning Jamie and Liskin Hayes, who will be moving away from Fort Collins to Illinois this fall. Jamie and Liskin, we are going to miss you. May love surround us and hold us all. Amen.